As a millennial, it's normal to feel stressed out and overwhelmed these days. As a therapist, I work with millennials every day who are feeling this way. And these are the things that they need to understand to really start to shift the way they look at self care and their overall well being. So, watch this video where I'm going to go through these things that you need to understand as well. In this video, we're going to go through 8 key areas that you need to really understand to shift the way you practice self-care. These 8 areas are actually called the 8 dimensions of wellness, and we're going to go through each one and some recommendations and how you can start applying them in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming for you. So this concept that we're going to be talking about self-care is really talking about wellness overall, and these 8 dimensions are 8 dimensions that have been shown that really contribute to wellness, and some of them are common, like you're going to think about food, nutrition, sleep, movement, things like that. And there's going to be some less common ones because we are looking at wellness as a very holistic kind of picture and all these different areas of your life and how if one of these areas, if you're not really focusing on them, how they can negatively impact your wellness. So as you can see here from the model, these are kind of the different components that we're going to go over today that each contribute to wellness. Obviously, wellness might be unique to you and there might be something here that's not listed, or maybe there's one of these areas where you feel like don't really contribute to your wellness. Okay, so if we start from the top, that's emotional wellness, well-being. So really that's thinking about how you cope with emotions, express emotions, how you move through them. I also often think about your emotional intelligence in terms of, are you in tune with when something's showing up for you? Can you identify it? Can you label it? How are emotions showing up in your interpersonal relationships? Pretty much just being really clear that when it comes to emotions, you feel like you have a good handle on how to move through them, or you have skills when you need to. So when I think about the emotional piece and what are kind of tiny, tiny, tiny little steps that you can start doing to implement this, I would really just start with noticing and naming, because I think a huge, huge part that people get stuck on is they don't really do a good job of noticing when they're in the grips of an emotional experience, nor do they have a good language to really name or label emotions. Check out this book review I did on Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett. That has great tools that are going to help you learn how to start to really learn how to move through feelings. So that's what I would say, this micro mini way of starting with this emotional health piece. One thing to note as I go through each of these different dimensions, I want to give you tiny, tiny micro little things that you can start thinking about, because at the end of the day, one thing that I notice a common pattern as to why a lot of my millennial clients are feeling stressed and overwhelmed is because they try to bite off more than they can actually chew. Or I want one thing, as you're looking at this, you might feel like, oh my gosh, there's so many ways that I can start, or it's too much, I never have time, I don't even have enough time to do the basics, and that's okay. The whole point is really thinking about micro mini ways that you can start to implement this. So that's why I'm thinking of tiny, tiny little things that you can do. The next one, as you can see, is the social wellness. So this is really thinking about the quality of relationships in your life and supportive, trusting, close relationships. I think this is a key concept when it comes to wellness, having your community, your tribe, the people that you can turn to, because at the end of the day, we are social animals, so we do need people. We were not meant to navigate this alone. Part of this is also not necessarily having people, right? It's not the quantity, but the quality. Are these relationships where you feel like you can turn to, you can trust, it's a safe space, you feel pretty empathetic, but also that they'll hold you accountable if that's what you need. They don't necessarily have to be family relationships, and even that, thinking about certain relationships that maybe are unhelpful and maybe you feel like you just don't have a choice and you have to be in them. So the one thing that I would really think about is first starting off with identifying who are your people, right? Who are the people that you turn to for support? And then what's just one behavior you can start to do to nourish that, or for you to seek connection in that. I even think of just a simple, like when you go home and whoever's home, if you do love someone, or if you don't, if you have a check-in with a friend, a colleague, whoever the case is, it's like, is there a way for you to really tune into that moment of connection instead of just the how are you, going maybe even just a little bit beneath the surface and really kind of giving active attention one to the other? That would be a super minor thing that you can start to do to cultivate that social connection. The next one that I want to talk about is occupational wellness. And so this is one that maybe it's less common when we think of wellness, although it's very clear that when you're in a toxic work environment, how harmful that can be for your overall well-being. So really we're thinking about, are you in a place in your job where you feel fulfilled, you're thriving, or even if it isn't meeting this bigger purpose, it's you feel like you have a good, healthy work-life balance, there's boundaries, there's respect, you work with coworkers that you feel have your back, and there's just a general good dynamic at work. So that would be one thing to think about, just overall occupational wellness. Now, if I think about like a tiny, tiny little step of where you can start, I would just start to identify like, what's the biggest stress at work that's within your control, right? Because I think that's the one thing with any of these concepts that we're going to talk about. Clearly, there's making room for there's things outside of our control. And that might be when you have to practice this concept of radical acceptance, right? And really kind of going back to this emotional wellness is moving through those feelings that show up when things are outside of your control And it's also looking at what are tiny, tiny things that are within your control. Now, with work, I know I talked about this in my last video. There seems to be this blend now where it's harder to distinguish like your home life and work life because we're constantly connected. Maybe the expectations at work are that you are answering an email or paying if there's an emergency, or even if it isn't an emergency, that's just the expectation. A lot of times when I work with my clients and we're talking about work environments, we realize that there's certain dynamics there that aren't helpful, but there's things that they're doing that are maintaining them. So for instance, if you are supposed to clock out at a certain time, but you don't do it because, well, you got really backed up, but it wasn't your fault and things just fell behind. And so when we start to talk through, like, okay, what would happen if things were just left behind? Would it just feel uncomfortable and you just have to accept that? So maybe letting go of some of those expectations, or is it really just poor management and they just need to be aware that the expectations are unrealistic and they need to feel some of that? And I know I'm not living in this unicorn world where I know that we need money to live, we need our jobs to sustain us. And I sometimes find thinking of tiny micro moves that could make a difference and that we could actually try to implement, right? So if I think about that, the first step for you to identify is what is the biggest stressor that's within your control at work. The next one is financial wellness. So this is really just kind of the realm of finances. And I think, again, this is one that's not commonly talked about when we think about wellness, but let's be real. When we're stressing out about money, that can have a huge impact on our overall well-being, right? When we feel like we're in debt or we can't clearly pay our bills, obviously that's going to have an impact on our well-being. And also like acknowledging the privileges that come with having money, that you can, invest in certain luxury self-care activities. Now, that's not my perspective when it comes to self-care, that you need to invest in these things in order to focus on wellness. But let's also be honest, certain things make things easier and they help. So when I think of this concept of financial wellness, is do you feel like you're balancing or managing your money well? I also think about this concept of your money mindset. Like, so what are the rules or stories that you have when it comes to money related to your upbringing? Do you have like this really fear, scarcity based mindset when it comes to money, or do you have more of abundance mindset? How do you handle money, right? So your relationship with money, do you make impulsive decisions, or the opposite? Are you too frugal and you can actually afford to maybe spend some money on something just for fun, but that feels really scary? So a good place to start is really maybe exploring that relationship with money. I think before you even start thinking about where you need to take action, whether it's putting a budget in place, having more knowledge, having more accountability, whatever it is, I would just really back up and start with like just doing a general prompt, like what is your relationship with money at this point? Whatever your situation is now, where do you think that your mindset or relationship with money is playing a role? So that's where kind of just that insight and knowledge. So then you can decide what you need to do next. Okay, this next dimension is environmental wellness. And so this can really look more of like a macro and micro level. So when I think of macro, I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but kind of a lot of us are struggling with this climate anxiety. And so thinking about environmentally, are there efforts that you can do to contribute to the planet's overall wellness, which then will indirectly impact you? When it comes to the micro level of environmental, I think about kind of different things, not only like your home and the people in your home and what that looks like, but even in terms of like your neighborhood. And some of this might be outside of your control in terms of how safe your neighborhood feels, or if you like you can take a walk outside and have access to a park, clean air, water, things like that. I understand some of us have privileges that others don't. So I definitely want to put that into context. And if you do have some of these basic necessities, when I think of environmental wellness, I also think of how is your home environment contributing to your well-being? Like, do you have a lot of clutter and that makes you feel overwhelmed? Is there a space where you feel like you can just relax, or an area where you can, dedicate to like a reading nook, a hobby, whatever the case is? So thinking about what are changes you can make in your immediate environment that could have a positive impact on your well-being? So one way to start is really think about like when you walk into your home, what do you feel, right? And is there different areas in your home that make you feel more relaxed, less relaxed? Do you have a yard and being in the green makes you feel really calm? Or on the opposite, you really prefer to have like a cozy little nook at home? And again, none of this is something that you have to invest a lot of time and money, but I would just think about what would be one area in your home that you can really convert in order to improve your overall well-being or make you feel just more calm or relaxed. Okay, the next dimension we're going to go through is physical wellness. So this really encompasses a broad kind of different areas. So as you can see here from the screen, this can include physical movement, it can include nutrition, it can include sleep, it can include kind of any recreational or prescribed medication. So anything that really is going to have an impact on your physiological well-being. And this is a dimension that most of us really associate with self-care, right? These are the dimensions and that they are important to really look at. Sleep is something that I really focus a lot of my clients should be non-negotiable. Now I understand that we don't all have the same opportunities, but trying to even think about, are there certain sleep routines that you can put in place, trying to have a consistent morning AM and PM routine, trying to get some sunlight in the morning, things like that. Physical, I think about, really, we all understand the importance of having some type of physical movement. And I would really kind of think about, what is the physical movement that feels value driven or joyful for you, right? So if you hate cardio, then find another activity that's still moving your body or feels good to you. So thinking about that with all these different areas, right? Nutrition, what does healthy habits look like for you? What are foods that just when you eat, you just don't feel good, don't sit well, it just has a negative impact in your energy or mood, things like that. And you can check out this book review that I did on Drew Ramsey's book that has other kind of concepts when it comes to food and mental health and that connection. Alcohol and other recreational drugs. Again, looking at that relationships with those substances. Is it purely social? Are you using that substance in a way to avoid anything? Are there times when maybe you overconsume? Things like that. So again, with this physical dimension, I know we can get really stuck here. And I would say the first step to really think about is in any of these areas, right? Whether it's movement, whether it's sleep, whether it's nutrition, I would encourage you to think about which is the one that you think would be the easiest to start to make a change in a gain, right? Because this is the thing, and in all these different dimensions that I'm talking about, I'm trying to think about little things that you can do. But what I want you to think about in this broad category is like, what's an easy win that you can start to implement, but that you will notice a positive change? Because this is the thing, I focus from the perspective of small, consistent changes is going to have a bigger impact than if you try to go hard all the way and it's going to be really overwhelming. And maybe you do good for a week or 2 weeks, but you just can't maintain the pace. And so I want you to think about in any of these areas, what would that look like? That could literally look like, okay, I'm going to incorporate having 1 glass of water in the morning extra once a day for a week or 2 weeks. And then once that becomes part of your habits or routine, what else could you implement? Or maybe it's really, you know what, I'm going to shift my night routine where I go to sleep 30 minutes earlier. Or you know what, I shift my night routine where, you know, I'm reading in bed versus like, you know, watching something really intense that keeps me up. Whatever it is, pick any of these areas and think what's a small win that you can start to work on and where that could become more of a habit. This next dimension of wellness, intellectual wellness. Again, I think this is one that isn't as commonly talked about. So anything that you do that's really going to keep your mind challenged and engaged and interested, whatever that looks like for you. That could be a hobby, right? Starting a new hobby that maybe you've always wanted to pick up. That could be, you know, playing a new instrument that's also going to be a little bit challenging, learning a new language. Whatever the case is, but something that's just going to keep your mind a little bit more sharp. Forget about the benefits that could have just overall in terms of your brain health. I'm just focused on even just like immediate well-being. I often hear from my clients, I just don't have time to do anything else. And so I would even think about what would be, again, a tiny thing. I'm sure you spend 5 or 10, 15 minutes at the minimum wasting time on something like social media, scrolling, checking emails that we really don't even, that are just like spam, whatever the case is. So I would think about, could you replace those 10 to 15 minutes, even 5 minutes with one of these activities, whatever the activity is, whether it's a quick kind of, let me play a game that feels really challenging on my phone, or you know what, let me, you know, pull up a YouTube video on how to play this instrument, whatever the case is, just something that you could do and that could take minimal time, but would also feel interesting and engaging. Okay, the last dimension that I'm going to talk about is spiritual wellness. So this can just be a broader perspective, like your sense of values when it comes to purpose, meaning, religious beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily have to include religious beliefs, the way you look at the universe, things like that, the connectedness of people, whatever that is, and then how you're fostering or feeding that. And so that's the other thing that I would encourage you to think about. However you identify spirituality, whatever that means or looks like for you, then what are the activities that you're doing daily, weekly, monthly, yearly that then kind of honor that, rituals that really are important to you? So then everything about like a prayer, if that's something that's important to you, do you wake up, you know, with doing prayers or go to sleep with prayers, or if it's really reading a scripture, or if spirituality to you means going to the beach once a week and connecting with earth and being in that moment of calm and connectedness. If spirituality means kind of helping people with a greater good, volunteering, and that's how you tap into it, Again, whatever that means for you, I would identify what would be something that you could start to implement in your life that you can noticeably feel that connection to your spirituality. Okay, so we went through a lot of different dimensions in this video. Let me know in the comments below which dimension feels like the hardest to maintain or even to start. Out of all these 8 dimensions that I went to, which is the one that you find pretty challenging? One of the themes that I went through is that we all are feeling overwhelmed. So one thing that I want you to really, really be aware of is not to overwhelm yourself with these different dimensions. Think of tiny, tiny little things you can do. And if 8 feel too overwhelming, which makes sense, pick 1, 2, 3 max and do tiny things that you could implement. In each one, I really wanted to make sure that you had things that hopefully would take less than 30 minutes in your life, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or things that you could already incorporate into your life, but just boost up, right? So if connection, it's okay when you have dinner with your family, really shifting the way you engage with your family in that moment. If it's more of like spirituality, maybe that looks like when you're taking your dog out for a walk, taking a pause and looking at the sunset with your dog. Whatever it is, you can also think about ways that you can incorporate this into your existing life and routines. And so, like I said, taking care of yourself as a millennial can feel really overwhelming. So watch this video next where I'll go through some things that maybe you're doing wrong, because you need to understand what you're doing wrong in order to implement these 8 dimensions of wellness in your life, ultimately notice an impact in your well-being. All right, guys, and like I always say, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. Thanks, guys.